I'm fine to go on.
Yep.
I'm fine.
Everyone?
Okay.
Fine, excellent. Okay, Alison, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thanks, Megan. Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm presenting today from the country of the Kabanga people in Coffs Harbour. And I'll be talking about how I've used process mining to explore the developmental trajectories that contribute towards young people engaging in domestic and family violence. Okay, so the study is being undertaken as an industry partnership between the New South Wales Department of Premier and Cabinet, the Northern New South Wales and Mid-North Coast local health districts and Southern Cross University. The study seeks to inform interagency service delivery and strategy in response to domestic and family violence on the north coast of New South Wales. So the focus of the study is young people who engage in violence and abuse towards members of their family. So why the focus on young persons' violence? Well, statistical data produced from the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics has shown that within the North Coast area of New South Wales, rates of young people charged by the police with domestic and family violence related assault offences and rates of reoffending are higher than most other areas of the state. In Australia in particular, knowledge about the prevalence and characteristics of families impacted by this violence remains limited. To date, no studies within Australia or New Zealand have used a longitudinal study designed to examine the timing or pattern of contributing factors in the domestic and family violence offending pathway for young people. So to address this research gap, this study has employed longitudinal linked administrative data from the New South Wales Ministry of Health and the New South Wales Police Force to investigate childhood risk factors and developmental trajectories for young people reported to engage in domestic and family violence. So the study cohort consists of 889 young people who have been issued a legal action by the police for a domestic and family violence offence between July 2008 and June 2018. So a legal action includes being formally charged by the police or being dealt with under the Young Offenders Act. So the majority of young people in the cohort reside within the Port Macquarie, Kempsey, Coffs Harbour, Grafton and Lismore areas as shown by the darker shaded areas on the map. These young people were born between 1994 and 2006 and were aged between 11 and 18 years when issued a legal action by the police for their first domestic and family violence related offence. The study cohort and additional data relating to these young people, including other offending, victimisation, drug and alcohol involvement, was sourced from the New South Wales Police Force COPS database for all young people from birth until June 2018. Where available, parental data, including domestic and family violence, drug, alcohol and mental health involvement was also sourced. Data relating to the health and behavioural characteristics of these young people was sourced from the New South Wales Ministry of Health data collections. Due to data availability within these data collections, only admissions to hospital, presentations to emergency department or contacts with the mental health service after age 5 years were included in the data set for analysis. The services of the Centre for Health Record Linkage were used to link and de-identify the original data from each agency. So I've conducted analysis of this linked data set to answer the following research questions. I firstly conducted a descriptive analysis to identify the socio-demographic, family and individual characteristics of these young people. I've then undertaken several multiple regression analyses to look at the strength of the relationship between these characteristics and the severity of a young person's first domestic and family violence offence and also subsequent domestic and family violence reoffending. I then used process mining to explore the temporal processes and pathways occurring prior to a young person being charged with a domestic and family violence offence. So for this presentation, I'll focus on how I've used process mining to answer this research question and some of the subsequent findings of this analysis. So firstly, what is process mining? Well, process mining is widely used within business research to explore complex temporal relationships between activities and resources, such as manufacturing processes within a large organisation. It's been increasingly employed within data linkage studies in the healthcare context to explore, for example, clinical pathways, as well as disease prediction and prognosis. To date, there is no available research evidence to suggest it has been used to examine developmental trajectories for young people. So process mining uses information included in an event log, as you can see on screen. Each event recorded in the log is required at a minimum to have a case ID, a timestamp, and an activity label. Process mining software employs algorithms to discover log-based ordered relations between activities within an event log. The process mining scans the event log for ordered relations and displays the result as a process model. The discovered process model depicts a visualization of the dominant paths and temporal process flows within the event log. So the event log created for my study contained 889 cases, with each case representing a young person, 26 activities relating to each variable of interest, and 57,360 events. Process models were discovered from the data contained within the event log using the DISCO process mining software. Models were created showing process flows from birth to a young person's first domestic and family violence offence, and comparative models were created to examine these process flows by gender and also offending frequency. So to give you an idea of what a discovered process model looks like, displayed on the screen is the model for all young people from birth until their first domestic and family violence offence. This model displays only the dominant pathways. So a really interesting feature of process mining is being able to show an animation of the process flows by time. So as young people in the study cohort were born between 1994 and 2006, start times have been synchronised, so all young people entered the model at the same time point. Each yellow dot you can see on the screen represents one young person. So as the dots join together, the process flows involving a larger number of young people become more obvious. A timestamp is displayed at the bottom right of the screen, which allows for the process model to be examined at different time points. So I'll discuss these discovered process flows in more detail in the upcoming slides. So as we're interested in comparing process models by gender and also offending frequency, process models were created comparing young people with only one recorded domestic and family violence legal action allocated to the non-repeat group, and young people with repeat legal actions allocated to the repeat group. I've reproduced the process model showing the three most dominant pathways from birth to first domestic and family violence offence for boys. So as briefly shown in the previous model for all young people, a dominant path for boys in both groups involved exposure to domestic and family violence, neglect, parental, alcohol and drug use in early childhood. The mean time from birth to first domestic and family violence exposure was between 35 and 37 months for boys in both groups. Comparisons of this process flow between groups showed that 70% of boys in the repeat offending groups were exposed to multiple incidents of domestic and family violence compared to 48% of boys in the non-repeat group. The dominant process flow from parental drug and alcohol use to being involved in a police person search or move on incident seen in the repeat offending group was not as evident in the non-repeat group. Almost half of the boys in the non-repeat group recorded for a person search or move on incident had no prior history of parental drug and alcohol use or neglect. So a unique mental health related pathway was evident for some boys in the non-repeat group. A small number of boys in this group were only recorded for mental health related events prior to being recorded for their first domestic and family violence offence. A process flow involving person search move on, property offending, alcohol use, being involved in a domestic and family violence verbal argument, and drug use was evident across both groups. The rates of involvement in these incidents were higher for boys in the repeat group compared to the non-repeat group. A similar process flow involving person search move on and violent non-domestic and family violence offending was consistent across both groups. Receiving a diagnosis for a conduct or adjustment disorder was also included in this process flow for boys in the repeat group, with 21% of boys in the repeat group receiving this diagnosis prior to their first domestic and family violence offence, compared to 11% of boys in the non-repeat group. 37% of boys in the repeat group had contact with a mental health service where a diagnosis was yet to be allocated prior to committing their first domestic and family violence offence. Okay, so reproduced models were also created for girls in both the repeat offending and non-repeat offending groups. As with boys, a similar pattern of domestic and family violence exposure, neglect, parental alcohol and drug use was seen for girls in both groups. Girls in the repeat group were on average first exposed to domestic and family violence at an earlier age, around 28 months, compared to young people in the other groups. 80% of girls in the repeat group were exposed to multiple incidents of domestic and family violence, compared to 66% of girls in the non-repeat group. Sorry about that. The process flow from parental drug or alcohol use, person search move on, property offence was unique to girls in the repeat offending group. 38% of girls in the repeat group were involved in property offending prior to their first domestic and family violence offence, compared to 16% of girls in the non-repeat group. The average age of first involvement in property offending was 13 years for these girls. So the dominant pathways towards violence for girls predominantly involved being a victim of violence. So this was in contrast to the findings for boys, where involvement in prior offending, alcohol and drug use formed their most dominant pathways. So similar victimisation and mental health related pathways were evident across both groups of girls. The process flow from being a victim of a sexual offence to receiving a diagnosis for stress, anxiety or thought disorder was consistent across both groups. Higher rates of sexual victimisation were, however, evident for girls in the repeat group, with 41% of these girls being recorded as a victim of a sexual offence prior to committing their first domestic and family violence offence. This is in comparison to 26% of girls in the non-repeat group. So a dominant process flow evident for girls in the non-repeat group included being involved in a person search or move on incident, followed by being the victim of a non-domestic and family violence related assault incident before committing their first domestic and family violence offence. So this just further highlights the dominant victimisation pathway evident for girls in this group. So in conclusion, my presentation today has provided a brief overview of process mining and some of the findings from this stage of my analysis. The limitations of this form of analysis must be acknowledged. Firstly, the quality of the process models produced are dependent on the quality of the data. Several data limitations were evident within my study. Accurate timestamp data was not available for some of the data obtained from the New South Wales Police Force, and only the age of the young person at the time of the incident was provided. So this prevented accurate temporal analysis of the timing between incidents occurring within the same year. Secondly, New South Wales health data prior to age 5 was not available for all young people in the cohort. This prevented early childhood injuries and illnesses from being included in the process models. So process mining, as I've done to discover process models and flows within the data, is an exploratory form of analysis. To further enhance these findings and establish statistical rigour, the models need to be tested using more traditional forms of statistical analysis. Despite this, the benefits of this form of analysis are evident. My study has shown that the application of process mining is not just limited to analysing workflow processes. The software utilised was simple and easy to use, and the models give a clear visual overview of processes that are not otherwise easily extracted from large data sets. So using process mining to analyse this data has highlighted several potential points of intervention. The findings clearly showed that at a local level, early childhood adversity was a predictor for negative outcomes in adolescence and young adulthood, further reinforcing the need for early intervention with young people exposed to domestic and family violence in their families. The findings also detail a strong relationship between adverse childhood environments, rates of young people's mental health problems, and domestic and family violence offending, highlighting the need for continued efforts to prevent childhood mental health problems and to respond earlier as these problems emerge. So thanks for listening today, and I'll just stop sharing the screen and answer any questions if anyone has any.
So my one, Alison, was what was the process for getting your ethics approved for this data collection? It would have been
yeah. Yeah, it was quite lengthy. Well, firstly, I just had to get the Southern Cross Uni ethics approval, and that was all fine. I then had to make individual data requests to each of the agencies. Initially, we really wanted to include data from the Department of Communities and Justice to get a bit more detailed picture of young people's family situations and early life involvements. But we unfortunately couldn't sort of negotiate a research agreement that Department of Communities and Justice and Southern Cross Uni would agree upon. So we sort of had running out of time and had to go ahead. So I had to do all that, and then I had to submit to the New South Wales Population and Health Research Ethics Committee. And that's mainly just to obtain the data from the New South Wales Ministry of Health. And yeah, that was quite a lengthy process as well. They were very particular and had to do a couple of resubmissions, but we got there in the end. So yeah, so it all worked out.
Yes, I've actually got a PhD student at COTS as well, Jane Moscow, and she's obviously working with children a fair bit with her research, and it was just an enormous process. So as part of your whole PhD journey, often ethics can really slow you up and also change maybe the course of what you're doing and what research you're collecting, data you're collecting. So yeah, good on you for having to stick through that massive hurdle.
Yeah, so I think just the main issue with getting the ethics was like young people in the data being able to be re-identified from their data. So that's why we had to, as mentioned about the limitations with only having the age of the young person and not an actual sort of incident start time and date. So yeah, so that has probably impacted on the accuracy of my models, but yeah, it's not too bad.
Excellent. So Megan has had to, Megan's had to duck out for a little bit, so I'm going to take over the chair duties just for a little bit. So is there anybody else that's got questions for Alison? I've looked at, I posted my own question on the app. And
I've got a question, Leslie, if you're...
Excellent, yeah.
Alison, great talk. I guess one of the first things that sort of jumps out at me is it's always so sad to see that there's such an interaction between that history of domestic and family violence and then its relationship to offending by the person who's experienced that. And that seemed to be particularly apparent in one of those slides in particular that you put up. In terms of understanding the existence of that domestic and family violence and knowing that as being part of an offender's background, how is that sort of ascertained? Does that come from plea material presented to courts, or is it self-reported?
So how I collected that data, so every time police attend a domestic and family violence related incident between adults in a household, if there's children present, then they're recorded in that event as a child at risk. So I collected all child at risk, domestic and family violence related child at risk incidents for the young people in my cohort. And then I also included parental data. So if that young person parent or responsible caregiver had been recorded as a victim in a domestic and family violence incident whilst the young person was alive, then that was also included in that variable.
Great, got it. Yep.
So I've just looked on the Hoover app, and actually GoMeet has posted a question and has asked, can you please talk about the significance of your research? Just a brief outcome in simple words.
Okay, well, I guess the main thing is this is the first study to use longitudinal data to look at pathways towards violence for young people. Because it is an industry partnership, I presented these findings to the North Coast Regional Leadership Executive, and were really interested in that early childhood adversity findings and would like the study to progress onwards to doing like a survey of service providers who work with young people, their families, young people exposed to domestic and family violence, just to get a good picture of like what services are out there, and then look at doing a case study analysis of some of these families to just see what services they actually access and how easy it is to access these services. Yeah, so I guess there's definitely opportunity to make a difference in that space, and I think it's just that early intervention is just so important, and like not only domestic and family violence offending, but any other sort of outcomes, like you can see the mental health, but other offending as well, which then is an enormous strain on society.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
That's right.
So has anybody else got any more questions for Alison?
I don't want to hold the time, but I've got another question if we've got time.
Absolutely. Yep.
So again, sort of, I guess a follow-on from the question that I asked earlier. I think in one of your slides you had the number of offenders that had that domestic and family violence background as a percentage of the number who then were engaged in offending themselves. Mm-hmm. Can you extrapolate from that sort of an idea of what percentage of children who are in that environment then later go on to be engaged in offending themselves? It's, yep. I think just about that number, it was quite a high percentage.
Yep. So if we just, I know that off the top of my head actually, if we look at the whole the cohort as a total, 70% of these young kids were exposed to domestic and family violence up to the year before their first offence, and 40% were exposed before age 3.
Wow.
So it's really quite shocking.
That's really shocking. Yeah. Yeah. It's and so your data, your process mining analysis will be used as a basis for determining intervention strategies. Is that right? To say, okay, this is somebody who's at risk for offending. How can we intervene in that journey?
Yeah, I don't think it goes sort of to that sort of level at this stage. At the moment, it was just to get an idea of what these pathways look like. So it's really exploratory, and just a way that we thought would be a nice clear visual overview of that sort of timeline.
Yeah, and it actually was very effective. That one slide that you put up with the yellow dots, and you could see the individuals moving through the institution, I suppose, from the point of offending through to various points in the process. I think it's, from a visualization.
Yeah, that was quite impressive.
Yeah, I really like that part too.
And I've got a question for you on a personal level, Alison. How do you decompress yourself and having all that knowledge there?
Well, I actually work for the police as an intelligence analyst and have done for a long time, so I'm quite used to dealing with this sort of information. It's just one of those things, because I deal with the data, I don't have that personal interaction, and I think that really does make a huge difference.
Is the data moving in the right direction, Alison? Are things getting better? In terms of that 70%, is that falling or going up? Or?
yeah, I don't think so. Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head, like yearly between year comparisons, but yeah, it's still very high. And yeah, sorry, I can't answer that better. Yeah.
And your data takes into account diversionary type programs, does it? So when people are diverted out of the criminal justice system, are they counted in the stats or not counted?
Yeah, yeah. So a young person may be like brought to police attention for that offence, and if they're dealt with under the Young Offenders Act, which includes like being issued a formal warning or a caution or a youth conference, yeah, they're included as well. So it's not just the young people who get the charge and then have to go to court and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just going to do the last call for questions. Are there any more questions from anybody? I've just checked the app and there isn't any on there at the moment. So if we're all happy, we can say thank you to all of our wonderful